In this video, we will talk briefly about the plugin's custom fields. So these are found in the Fields tab of the plugin settings. We'll just go over what the plugin installs by default, what you can do with the default fields, and how you can add your own custom fields. And when we do that, we'll go over what some of the field types are that the plugin supports. So first, let's talk about the fields that the plugin installs initially. These are just a group of fields that the plugin has had since the very beginning, and it primarily focuses around address, city, state, country, zip code, phone. You can see it's kind of US-centric. There's no requirement that you use these fields. You can use them, you can not use them, you can delete them. However you use the plugin is up to you, and what data you collect is up to you. You'll notice in the edit column, it'll tell you which fields are native to WordPress and which ones are not. The ones that are not allow you to edit the information about the field. One thing, when you go to edit a custom field, it will not let you change the option name, just the field label, whether the field is used or not, which is the display button, and whether it's a required field or not. It won't let you change the field type or the option name. The option name is the field's meta key that is stored in the WordPress database, and that's why we don't let you change it. If you need to change something about it, then you need to create a new field. In order to change the order of the fields, you can drag and drop. So if you want, for example, email to be right after name but before address, you just drag and drop it, and then that'll be reflected in the registration form. One quick thing to note about the columns here in the Fields tab is, as I mentioned, you can't delete the WordPress native fields, but any custom fields you can delete. And if you're not using any of those fields, I do recommend that you delete them. It'll keep things a little cleaner, since why have a field in here that you're not ever going to use? So that's an option. Then you have the field label. That's what displays next to the input, the HTML input field. The option name, that is the meta key that's stored in the WP user meta table in WordPress. You have the field type. This tells you what type of field it is. The display column does generate a little bit of confusion with people, and in an upcoming version that's actually going to change. We're going to change the name of this column. But what this means is it displayed as part of the registration form and the user profile update form? If this is unchecked, this field will only be used on the admin side user profile, and it won't be used on the front end in the registration form. Required, that should be relatively obvious. If you have this checked, that field must have a value in order for registration to continue. If it's a checkbox, it'll be indicated here. If it is a native field, you won't be able to edit it. If it's a custom field, you'll have a link to click to edit that field. And then also this user screen column, what that means is the users, all users screen has a table of users. So if we add, for example, country to the user screen, when we look at users, all users, you'll see that adds the country value to the users, all users screen. So if you have some fields where you want to see in your table of users, you want to see that value, then you go ahead and add it to the user screen. Now let's quickly talk about some of the fields that are set to display. As I mentioned, are generally address and phone. Email is always required as part of registration. That's a WordPress requirement. We do have a confirm email field that you can use as an option as well. So if you want the user to enter their email twice so that it's compared to verify that they've entered a correct email, you can use that field. Similarly, these password fields, they're not enabled by default because the plugin's default configuration will email a random password to the user, to the email address that they provide, and they'll be able to use that initial password to log in, and they can then change that password if you give them a user profile page where they can update their registration information and password. They can change the password there to whatever they want. Some people like to include allowing a user to set their own password when they register. So if you want to do that, you can enable these fields. The password field will be the actual password. The confirm password is just a confirmation field to compare, so that if they typed something that they thought they typed but made a typo and didn't really realize it, the confirm password field will do a comparison check and won't let registration continue until those two fields match. The TOS is just a default field that we include for terms of service, and we'll talk about that a little bit when we talk about the plugin's dialogues. And it's an optional field. There are some additional fields here that aren't used on the front end at all, so you won't see a checkbox or a deletion. But if you want to include these in the all users screen, they're very easy to add. This is the registration date that the user registered. That's a default WordPress field, and a field that the plugin captures, which is the user's registration IP address. You can have that included on the all users screen as well. So let's just very quickly go through maybe customizing this a little bit. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take out the default fields that are registration fields here, and we'll take out the confirm email. All right. So now we've limited our registration form to just email, which, like I said, is always included. First name and last name. And also another one that's always included is the username. That's not shown on this because it's always included and it's always the first field. There's a way to move that, but you have to do it programmatically with a filter, and that'll be the subject of another video. So let's take a look at our registration form. All right, you can see here we have choose a username, first name, last name, email, all required. And remember what I mentioned here is that any of the fields we leave in this table, those are going to be used on the admin side of things. So if we go look at our profile, any of the WordPress native fields are already part of the WordPress form for the user profile. But if you get down here to the bottom, you see WP members additional fields. Remember, I said anything that's not checked to display but is still included in this table will be included here as an admin field. So that's kind of important to remember. If you want to keep this kind of neat and tidy, we can delete those. So let's go ahead and do that, since we're not going to be using these in our demonstration. We're just going to get rid of the address fields. You may want to use them or keep them. Like I said, that's up to you. So let's refresh this. And now we don't have any fields because we've basically taken out everything that would show there. Oh, the password isn't going to show. Confirm email, those aren't going to show. And the rest are native fields. So we've limited this down to essentially just WordPress native fields. Now let's talk about adding a few custom fields. So first of all, if you want to add just a standard text field, we're going to do that, and we're going to make this display. We won't make it required. Okay, so now that's in our list of fields here. If we go back to the registration form and we refresh it, you see here's our custom field. So that's just a standard text field. Most of these fields operate the same way. The more recent versions of the plugin support HTML5, which gives you the ability to specify certain field types, and those are pre-validated when the user submits the form. So an email field type is going to have HTML5 validate that an email has been entered. So it's going to look for an @ symbol and a dot. Password field type is similar to text as well, except that it doesn't have it doesn't display the letters, numbers, characters to the user. It just displays dots. URL field, again, similar to a text field, except that HTML5 is going to validate that it has a web address in it. So those are all very similar to the text field we just showed. Now let's talk about a couple of these other field types. Checkbox, if you select that, it's going to include a couple of extra things that it needs information on. So let's call this my checkbox. And we're going to display this. Now, if you make a checkbox required, the way that HTML works is when you submit the form and we're validating the form, required means if in the case of a checkbox, means a value has to be passed. The only way a checkbox passes a value is if it's checked. So in the case of something like a terms of service, or have you reviewed my site's refund policy, or things like that, that's a requirement where you're saying this box must be checked that you did something, or registration cannot continue. It shouldn't be checked as required for something like I'm opting into your email newsletter, because when you require it, that means the box must be checked, not necessarily reviewed, because the answer might be no. If the answer is no and it's unchecked, that's not the same. So just keep that in mind. And anybody who's unclear on that, if you're not sure how that works, feel free to send me a question through the contact form or ask it in the forum. That's fine too, and we can try to explain it better. Checked by default means when the form loads, is the checkbox already pre-checked for the user? So if you want it to display as pre-checked, you would check checked by default. And stored value is the value that the checkbox has. In a lot of cases, unless you're using this data outside, this isn't going to matter. But if you need to sync this data up with something else, this stored value may be very important as to what you choose. So you want to think about that. If you're linking to a newsletter sign up, or you're exporting user data that gets imported into a CRM or something like that, you want to give careful thought to what the value is of the checkbox. In a lot of cases, it's just, did you do something? And yes, I did. So yes would be adequate. But this has to be filled out. The form will not complete when you submit to add a field if there's no stored value. It's going to throw an error message and tell you you have to have a stored value to create a checkbox. So we just called this one yes. And here's our new checkbox. And you can see our checkbox we can change easily in the fields table if we want this to be checked by default or not by checking this box. And if we need to make a change, we can edit it accordingly. And remember, I said option name can't be changed, field type can't be changed, but we can change these other things about the field. So that's a checkbox. Let's move on and talk about multiple checkbox. Now, multiple checkbox is a group of checkboxes, and a user can check none, they can check one, or they can check several. So there are some additional things, and you'll notice this is similar in terms of display and required, but these two things are different than the other checkbox field. So what are these? First, we have the stored values delimiter. So when we store values for the checkbox selections, they're stored as a string rather than an array in the database. And we separate each selection. So if the user makes more than one selection of the checkboxes, we're going to separate those values with a delimiter. The default for this is a pipe character, but you can set that as a comma if you need to. And in some cases, if you're using that data in another application or another plugin uses data from that custom field and you're trying to create a field that both plugins will recognize, that value may need to be a comma. If you're just using it in WP members and you're exporting that data to your own system, it may not matter. Again, this is another thing that if you have a deeper question on what should I use, go ahead and ask in the forum or send us a message through the contact form. But the choice is there for you to decide what the delimiter is. And then the next important thing is to set the values. Now let me just point out, I'm working on improving this from a user interface standpoint, but for now, this box gets reused for several field types. Multiple checkbox, select dropdown, multiple select, and radio group. The only one where this first default value really makes sense is if it's a single dropdown. Multiple checkbox, this doesn't make any sense at all, and it's really there as a default. So in this case, let me just explain. Get rid of that, and now what we're looking at is the possible options for your checkbox. The first value is what displays as the label for the checkbox, separated by a pipe character, if you can see that there, and then followed by the value that will be saved if the user selects that checkbox, and then a comma until you get to the last row. Same thing, but no comma. Okay, hopefully that makes sense to everybody, and I'm going to save this with just the defaults, and then we'll look at it in the form so you can see what I'm talking about. It's what displays to the user, no space, pipe character, what is saved in the database, no space, comma. So this is my multiple checkbox. So multiple checkbox. And here we are. And don't you know, I forgot to display it. So let's set that here in the fields table. So now we've added our custom text field, our checkbox, and our multiple checkbox. Let's look at our form. Okay, see there's our checkbox, here's our multiple checkbox, and you can see this is the label, this is what displays to the user. Let me just right click and inspect this so I can show you. When we look at the HTML, you see each particular checkbox has value. This is the saved value. That's what, if the user selects this, that's what's going to save in the database. And that's that value after the pipe character. So hopefully everybody's clear on that. Let's move on and we'll talk about a similar field type. Select dropdown. You'll see we get the same defaults, and remember what I said, this is really the only one where this makes sense, and you'll see it when I make this here. We'll go ahead and display this, and we'll use the same defaults just for example. So there it's in our fields table, and now here it is in our form. And see, this is the select one. So it starts off with a non-selected value. You may want to have a pre-selected value, so there's no requirement that you use what I'm showing you. These are just defaults to give you an example. If, in this example, what this is there's no value to this one, right? We looked at, let's go edit it. See, there's nothing after the pipe character except the comma, so that's an empty value that just has a label that displays to the user, but there's no value. So if it was a required field and the form was submitted, this field would have to have one of these values, not this one. Again, if you have questions, please ask. So we can select any one of these, and the selected value, just like the multiple checkbox, would have this value stored in the database. And this is a pick one kind of field, so only one of these is going to be able to be selected. Okay, now there is a multiple select. So let's talk about that very quickly. Again, you should notice a theme here. Because this can have multiple selections, we have the stored values delimiter again, and that's pipe and comma. This one, this doesn't make sense either, because nothing's going to be selected if nothing is actually selected by the user, so we don't need to give them a pre-selected empty value. So the way that looks is, we'll refresh our page. See, this is a multiple select, and so the user can select, and you can click Control and pick more than one. You can Shift and select more than one. Okay, that's what that type of field is for those of you that may not be familiar with HTML field types. So now let's talk about radio group. That's the last one that is similar here. Okay. Again, take this out because it doesn't make any sense. Enter your values, what displays to the user, pipe character, what is saved in the database, comma. And let's look at our form. There's our radio group. Now this is what a radio group is. Only one can be selected. So if you have, some people get confused on this. This is similar to a multiple checkbox, except that a multiple checkbox, more than one can be selected. In a radio, only one can be selected. Okay. So those are some core field types. Now let's just talk real quickly about two others that can be a little bit confusing, and that's file and URL. These are upload field types. Currently, these are only supported on the front end forms. The WordPress user profile does not support the type of form submission that you need to be able to upload a file. So it can only be handled on the front end, so the register form and the user profile form. So let's call this my image. We'll make this an image type. Now, the extra information here is what type of field types will you accept. In this case, we'll just put the defaults in there. Separated by pipe characters. So there we go. And there's our field upload. So that's the primary field types, how to add them, and how to work with the plugins Fields tab. If you have any questions, let me know. Either use the contact form or the members forum.